Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor at New Life Presbyterian Church in Yorktown. Welcome back to our series on learning to love Leviticus, where we are actually nearing the end of the completion of this study of the book of Leviticus as we find ourselves in the latter portion of this section on instructions for holiness that you can see from the outline began way back in chapter 17, really beginning the second half of the book after the Day of Atonement, which is recorded in chapter 16 and runs all the way through chapter 26, although technically I would say it runs all the way through chapter 25, and we'll be dealing with the second half of chapter 25 in this lesson. Chapter 26, as I mentioned last time, is actually a chapter that deals with the sanctions within the covenant, blessings for keeping the covenant, and curses for breaking the covenant. That covers all of chapter 26. And then we have this epilogue, instructions for dedication in chapter 27, which brings us to the end of the book. And so we're in the second half of Leviticus chapter 25. And if you remember from last time, chapter 25 deals with more sacred time, specifically dealing with holy years. You might remember back in Leviticus chapter 23, we dealt with holy time, with the Sabbath day, and then the various festivals and feasts that the Lord appointed for the Israelites to observe. And then we had chapter 24, which was a brief break from the details of those appointed feasts and holy time. But then it gets picked back up again in Leviticus chapter 25. But instead of looking at holy days or maybe holy weeks, as we did in chapter 23, we actually get holy years. And this in two ways. Remember the first 7 verses, and this is what we looked at last time, was instructions for the Sabbath year. So for 6 years, the Israelites were to plow and sow and harvest their fields. But on the 7th year, they were to allow their fields to lie fallow. So they were not to plant, they were not to cultivate, they were not to reap. So that happens every 7th year, and that's referred to as a Sabbath year, so the land can have its rest. But now we pick up with the second of those that additional sacred time mentioned in Leviticus chapter 25, and that has to do with the Jubilee year. And actually, most of the chapter is taken up with instructions for the Jubilee year. And so we're going to get into some details there related to understanding what was appointed and required and commanded in relationship with this Jubilee year. So the Jubilee year is after 7 Sabbath years. There was to be a Jubilee year. So remember, one Sabbath year would happen every 7 years. And so after 7 Sabbath years would be 7 times 7 years. And so in the 49th year, there would be a Sabbath year. And there's some questions about exactly whether the Jubilee year happened in coordination with that 49th year, or whether the 49th year, which would have been a Sabbath year, was actually followed by the year of Jubilee. And there's actually some stuff even in Leviticus 25 that makes that difficult to come down dogmatically on. But in any event, it was either the 49th or the 50th year where there is this Jubilee year. And it's characterized by a number of things that we can look at. It started with the blowing of the trumpet on the Day of Atonement. We learn that in verse 9 in this chapter. Once again, you'll get much more out of these lessons, these YouTube lessons, if you've actually read the content in the book of Leviticus that we're covering. So we're not going to take time to read verses 8 through 55 on the Year of Jubilee in our time together on the video lesson. But if you haven't read it, you should pause right now, go read chapter 25 in the book of Leviticus, and this will make a lot more sense and you'll get a lot more out of it. But you can see in verse 9 of the chapter that the Jubilee year was to start with the blowing of the trumpet on the Day of Atonement. And remember, this Day of Atonement goes back to chapter 16. We actually read again about the Day of Atonement in chapter 23 because it's part of that sacred time, one of the holy days in the year for Israel. But the Day of Atonement was when the tabernacle was cleansed and the sins of the people were atoned for in a very collective, definitive way. And so the Day of Atonement represented this day of fresh starts, of clean starts, of new beginnings. And so we get this again with the Year of Jubilee, because the Year of Jubilee is a year of new beginnings, marked by a time of rest, of release, and of renewal. A couple things to note here about the Year of Jubilee as we try to wrap your minds around what exactly this year entails. The land received rest from cultivation. So in that regard, it's very similar to the Sabbath year that we've looked at already. But in addition now to the land receiving rest from cultivation and its burden of being plowed, the property is restored to individuals who had maybe put it up as a pledge people who had incurred debts. But all that property, and we'll get into these details in just a second, but property went back to the original owners. And so people were returned to their family inheritance. Remember that the land is the inheritance of the people. When this land is allotted in the book of Joshua, when the Lord is faithful to bring the people into the land, remember, they're not in the land yet. In the book of Leviticus, they've just come out of Mount Sinai, or they've just come out of Egypt. 3 months after leaving Egypt, they arrive at Mount Sinai, and then they're at Mount Sinai for an extended period of time that begins in Exodus chapter 19, and that extends all the way to Numbers chapter 10. And with Numbers chapter 10, they leave Sinai. They begin to move toward the promised land. They send spies toward the promised land. And in Numbers chapter 13, the spies come back and say, we can't go in. They show themselves faithless. And so the Lord's response to their faithlessness is this generation will not enter the land. And so they wander in the wilderness for 40 years until all that generation, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, because Joshua and Caleb were faithful, believed in the word of the Lord, and wanted to go into the land at that time. But they didn't go because the people acted in unbelief. And so Joshua and Caleb then enter into the land with that next generation in the book of Joshua. We read about the conquest of the land in the book of Joshua, but also beginning in chapter 13 of the book of Joshua, we read about the allotment of the land that is given to the specific tribes of Israel as their inheritance. And because it was given to them by the Lord as part of their inheritance, that land was never to change hands permanently. It wasn't even to change hands from clan to clan permanently. It wasn't to be given to or demanded or taken by other tribes from another tribe, let alone a foreigner taking that land permanently. And so in the year of Jubilee, if land had been exchanged because of debts, and again, we'll get into this in just a second, in the year of Jubilee, that land returned to its original owner, so that individual received back the family inheritance, whether or not that debt had completely been paid off or not. It just goes back. And people were released from debts, as you can see there as the third point. Property was restored. People were released from debts. Those are in some ways are coinciding. But one of the other things, in addition to land that could be put up, is someone could actually enlist themselves as indentured servants. And so that would come to an end in the year of Jubilee as well. And so people were released from their bondage if they had sold themselves as indentured servants. And so this year of Jubilee is just this wonderful celebration, a year long celebrating, again, rest for the land, release and renewal for the people. Like with the Sabbath year, there were agricultural, religious, economic, civic, and eschatological dimensions to Jubilee. Now, that's how we actually broke down the lesson last time as we went through the Sabbath year. And we could actually do that again, but I'd like to break down these extended verses, and we probably aren't going to get through verses 8 through 55 just in this lesson. So we'll probably take a couple lessons to talk about Jubilee, just so we can keep these two lessons in an acceptable kind of time frame. I don't want to have a 45-minute video lesson. So we're going to try to keep this around 20 minutes and probably have to take another 20 or 25 minutes to finish the book of Jubilee, or I mean the year of Jubilee in Leviticus chapter 25. But we could actually treat it with all these dimensions again, because what was true of the Sabbath year with these dimensions is also true of the year of Jubilee. We could say that Jubilee eliminated land abuse by allowing the land to rest, so there's some agricultural dimensions. Again, we talked about the cancellation of debts, which has both civic and religious overtones to it. Land was returned to original owners, and that has a really significant impact on economic balance and maintaining economic balance within the nation of Israel. It repaired the family and kept it intact. Remember, I talked about the land being something that was inherited by families and clans and tribes. And so this would not be something that just kept the family intact over one generation, but from generation to generation to generation, any land that had been pledged or given to someone else because of a debt was returned in the year of Jubilee. And so that land perpetually remained within the family that gave this long-term stability to the Israelite communities. And it terminated slavery. Again, I talked about that, which has, again, religious, economic, and eschatological dimensions. All of these, actually, we could talk about eschatological dimensions that are looking forward to the end time and the fullness and the consummation of these ideas of like canceling debt, entering into the security of our inheritance, the termination of all forms of bondage. Those kinds of things have eschatological dimensions as well. So we just say this in summary, that Jubilee was a sacred time. That's what we're doing. We're talking about more sacred time, a sacred time of great celebration and freedom. And this extended for, again, an entire year. It's not a Jubilee day or a Jubilee week. It's a Jubilee year. So the land was to have rest again that year, and all the land was to be returned to its original owners, and people were released from debts. And this particular celebration in Israel didn't really look back to any particular redemptive work of the Lord, like we see with Passover. Remember, Passover is a celebration marking sacred time that looks back to the Lord's work in delivering his people from Egypt, redeeming them from Egyptian bondage. We can think of the Feast of Ingathering and the Feast of Booths, where the people were to set up booths. Again, we talked about this back in Leviticus chapter 23. They set up booths to recall their time in the wilderness and how the Lord was faithful and sustained them and brought them now into the land. But this particular celebration of Jubilee was really something that looked forward and not backward. And it looks forward not just eschatologically, but the Jubilee year kept people looking forward in a lot of ways, as we'll see as we think about the freedom of debt and the freedom of slavery and all those kinds of things. So rather than break it down by agricultural dimensions and religious dimensions and economic dimensions, civic, eschatological, and the way we looked at the Sabbath year, which we could do it that way, I actually want to cover it in 3 points, 3 alliterated points. So let's look at the problem that Jubilee is addressing, and then the path to the solution of that problem, and then some principles that we can apply from the chapter and understand the kind of instruction that this has for the church today, if any, right? I mean, that's one of the things that we have to wrestle with in the book of Jubilee, or in the book of Leviticus, sorry. So the problem, the path, and the principles is the way we want to break this down. And again, we're not going to get through all of this in the next 10 minutes. So we'll see how far we can get. At least let's try to get through the problem, and then we'll maybe anticipate what the path is moving forward to resolve the problem that Jubilee is addressing. So again, just to reiterate something I've said already, land was given to God's people as their inheritance. It could not permanently change hands. There's an interesting story in 1 Kings chapter 21 during the reign of King Ahab, who was a very wicked king in the northern kingdom of Israel, after the kingdom of the people had split into two after Solomon. Remember, there's a northern territory of Israel with its capital in Samaria, a southern territory of Judah with its capital in Jerusalem. So you have southern kings, kings of Judah, you have northern kings, kings of Israel. Ahab is one of the northern kings. He's a king of Israel and a very wicked king. He marries Jezebel, and Baal worship is instituted within the nation of Israel. He marries Jezebel, who brings that in. Baal worship is instituted. The ministry of Elijah occurs under the monarchy of Ahab, as he's addressing and confronting Ahab with his covenant unfaithfulness. And in 1 Kings chapter 21, part of Ahab's wickedness is displayed for us. It's displayed in all kinds of ways, but particularly in chapter 21, you might recall that Ahab wishes to have this vineyard that's owned by this fellow named Naboth. And when he goes to Naboth and asks for him to sell his vineyard, Naboth declines. And it can seem like maybe Naboth just has a sentimental attachment to the vineyard, or he's just being obstinate in the face of the king. Remember, Ahab then goes home and he pouts because Naboth won't sell him the vineyard. Jezebel comes in and says, what are you upset about? And he says, well, Naboth won't sell me his vineyard. And Jezebel says, really? Are you not the king? I'll make sure you get the vineyard. And so basically, Naboth is falsely accused of blasphemy, and he's put to death, and then Ahab takes his vineyard. Again, a very wicked act on the part of a king abusing power. But if we look at Naboth and his motivations for not selling the vineyard, it has to do with this family inheritance. That land and property was not just to change hands at a whim, even if the king was asking for it. The king was not above the law. The king was subject to covenant law. And so Naboth doesn't sell him this vineyard because the land was very important to families and clans and tribes as part of their inheritance. Now, if someone experienced financial difficulty, if someone entered into poverty in the nation of Israel, they would often have to sell possessions. And ordinarily, these possessions would come in the form of land or even themselves. Okay, so that's where we go back to the year of Jubilee. All property returns to the original owners, and people are freed from their debts and their bondage and their indentured servanthood if they've had to do that, if they've had to sell themselves in order to get out of debt. And they would exchange these possessions, land or themselves, to secure a loan to deal with that debt, and then hopefully get to a point where that would be paid off. Again, part of this wonder and beauty of Jubilee is that every 50 years, this debt would be released, whether they were able to work themselves out of that or not. It would just be removed. Again, creating this balance. We'll talk about some of the benefits of that. So inescapable debt, and even inescapable debt that's handed down to children and to heirs and to subsequent generations, can very much erode the social fabric. It leads to gross economic imbalances. And this, of course, creates impairment in relationships. People do not perceive others as equals. There's a vast difference between the rich and the poor, those who have and those who have not. So there's this increasing divide within a civilization when there's gross economic imbalance that does erode social fabric. People themselves who are suffering from poverty can become very hopeless if they don't feel there's any way out, if the debt just continues to climb and get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they don't feel there's any way to climb or work themselves out of that debt, they can become very hopeless and despondent. And that can express itself in really one of two ways as it gets severe. They can either end up in despair, or they can end up in anger and revolt. And of course, history shows both of these kinds of things happening in different kinds of environments. But we want to avoid inescapable debt in a cultural sense, in an economic sense. And so the Year of Jubilee is designed to address this problem. Sellers, those who sold land, we're going to deal with land first, but sellers always had the right to buy back the land. Let me move my image up here. Sellers always had the right to buy back the land as soon as they were able. So if this land is sold in order to deal with a debt, so in other words, they would sell the land. The person who takes the land offers a loan, but then takes this land. The benefit of receiving this land as a pledge is this person now gets to cultivate the land and gain from the cultivation of the soil and what the soil produces. This would not only produce food, but it could also help to raise and secure livestock and advance livestock and prosper in livestock as well. So agriculture and livestock are big deals. Remember, they're not carrying around $10 bills and $20 bills. Wealth is secured in land and animals for the most part in the nation of Israel and in this part of the Near East at this point in time. And so there's a lot to be said for this person who is willing to offer a loan in exchange for this land, because the land offers them a great amount. But it's not really this permanent sale. The land is kind of put up as a kind of a pledge. And as soon as the person was able to buy that land back, it's not that the person who had offered the loan can say, no, I'm actually keeping the land. At any point in time in Israel, that land could be bought back by the person who sold the land initially. And so it was, again, not to change hands permanently. And what this would do is it would prevent a class of rich landowners, and I've talked about this before, kept family and land structures intact. So, I mean, just imagine if someone came in debt, they sold the land, and then they wanted to buy it back, and the person who acquired it, because of this person's debt, refused to sell it back. And then this just ends up in this person's family over generation, over generation, over generation. And so other people who enter into poverty or experience some kind of calamity that produces poverty will have to, again, look to the rich to secure the loan. The rich takes this land and then refuses to give it back when this person works himself out of debt. And so a certain select group of people continue to amass land and accumulate it, while others continue to be at risk of poverty. And again, this is going to lead to a system that creates vast differences between the haves and the have-nots. The Year of Jubilee is going to wipe all of that away. It's going to keep an economic balance within the people, preventing this class of rich landowners and then a second class of poor people. And so that's part of the wonder and the wisdom of Jubilee. Now so when you think about this, so the person has to sell back the land. The person doesn't get to keep the land permanently if it's sold to them or entrusted to them or pledged to them by a debtor. Don't think of this as akin to socialism, where no one actually can own property. This is actually an instance of God's grace where no one can lose property permanently. People have actually been given property already by the Lord. In his grace, he has provided land in the promised land to all of the tribes of Israel with the exception of the Levites. Now, the Levites are given villages, but they don't actually have an inheritance in the land, and that's because the Lord is their inheritance. And so can't go too far into this, but the Levites kind of represented Israel as a whole, as a priestly nation, right? The Levites were the priests, and it reminded all of the people, because this was a kingdom of priests, that ultimately their inheritance was the Lord himself, not just pieces of land, but the Lord himself. But this isn't an instance where no one actually owns property, because they do own property. That's not they don't own property in the sense that this land is mine and it's not the Lord's. That's something that's important for Israel to keep in mind. And that's actually important for us to keep in mind. We don't own things that are ours and not the Lord's. We do own things that are ours and not someone else's. That's why the 8th commandment is binding. Don't steal. Well, if no one has ownership, there's no such thing as theft. But there is such thing as theft because the Bible teaches real private ownership. But that's not to be an exclusion. They don't own privately in exclusion to God, but they own it in a sense other people don't own it. But that's what's going on here with the Year of Jubilee is not no one can own any land. It's that no one can permanently lose land because God, by his grace, has given people land that doesn't belong to other people permanently. And so that's important to keep in mind. This is not a program of socialism. Jubilee was not instituted as a punishment on the rich either, but to protect the poor and to remind Israel of a very important truth, and that is that the land did not ultimately belong to them, but to the Lord. Again, it can belong to one person and not another, but it can't belong to one person and not the Lord. Verse 23 reminds us that the land should not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. Wonderful verse there at the end of verse 23. Strangers and sojourners with me, the Lord says to his people. And so they're not to be inordinately attached to the material things because ultimately their inheritance is the Lord. Last thing here, Derek Tidball, in his commentary in the book of Leviticus, says, debt was seen as a major evil. It was both debilitating and dehumanizing for those who suffered it. Everything had to be done to overcome it as soon as possible. So none need wait for the 50th year if they could extricate themselves in the meantime. But Jubilee meant that at least once in a lifetime, freedom could be acquired, even if all other means of achieving it had failed, and there were other means to try to achieve it before the Year of Jubilee. The path begins gently, outlining the steps that can be taken in the case of a minor debt that can easily be redeemed, and then climbs with increasing difficulty until it reaches its high point with the words, even if they are not redeemed in any of these ways, they and their children are to be released in the Year of Jubilee. That's how the chapter ends there in chapter 25, even if they are not redeemed in any of these other ways. So it explores a number of steps. And so that's what we want to look at next time. We want to begin looking at this path to deal with the problem. And we read about one step in verses 25 to 28. And then there's a couple exceptions to what is outlined in step 1 in verses 29, 31, and 32 and 34. So you jump from verse 28 to verse 35, where we get into step 2. And we read about step 2 in verses 35 to 38. Step 3, then, we read about in verses 39 to 46. Step 4, verses 47 through 53. And then step 5, verses 54 and 55, which is basically the promise and the hope of Jubilee, of rest and release. And so we're going to look at these 5 steps next time as to how this problem potentially addressed by people getting in debt and selling land as a pledge is dealt with. So only halfway through. Again, this is the second of 3 points we want to deal with. We looked at the problem, and then we want to look at the path next time. We also want to look at principles. So we may only get through the path next time, but we'll move through and get through as much as we can in the next lesson, continuing to look at the Year of Jubilee in Leviticus chapter 25. So hopefully you'll come back and join us then. God bless.